All right, that was the Bogner Shiva lead channel, trying to recreate sort of Jerry Cantrell, Allison Chains tone from Man in the Box. Yeah, really thick, gained up. But as you can see, there's really not a lot going on here. I've got no compression, just the amp, gain set really high. EQ isn't too extreme. Obviously, I got it a little treble heavy right now. Master's right about where you'd expect it to be. I've got a couple of on hammer Bogner 412 vintage 30 IRs running, 50% left right. Little studio reverb going, really low mix, 3%. And I've got the enhance block on just to get that Jerry Cantrell double track thing going on. And I know people don't think this is a high gain amp, and it's not, but I do want to kind of show you what else this tone can do really quickly. And really quickly show you what a tube screamer can do to just clean this amp up in the bass. So I'm going to play some stuff really quickly without the tube screamer. Yeah, very high gain. Probably what most people, except for you metal guys, would define as a little too much gain. But for that Allison Chains thing, it's really kind of beautiful. Obviously, as you have the gain up on this amp, the bass really has to come down, which I think is the case with a lot of Marshalls. And before I kind of dive into more tones here, I want to just go over the controls of the amp. So I'm on the lead channel right now. As you can see here, bass, middle, treble are all represented exactly like you'd expect them to be. Same thing for presence. The actual amp has a shared presence control, but obviously you don't have to do that on the Axe effects. The gain control on the real Shiva would be the input drive on here. So that's something to not get confused about. The bright switch is definitely modeled, and I like to leave it on most of the time. It's not a very obvious bright switch, but I think it cleans up the treble in a really pleasing way. The master volume on the amp sim, I believe, actually models the volume on the actual amp. So we don't get a master volume modeled as far as I know, fine with me. And we also don't have the boost volume on our sim, but the input trim serves as kind of a substitute for the boost on the Shiva, because the Shiva does have a boost. The mode knob right here, or sorry, mode switch is not modeled, so that's not an option. And there's one more, the depth control on the Axe effects actually models a knob that's on the back of the Shiva called the excursion knob, but that is really more for playing at low volume and dialing some bass into your tone, which is not really a consideration for us since we're in Axe effects land. So you can kind of ignore that. I always leave it at 0. And yeah, pretty simple layout. And the clean channel, which I'll show you in a second, is even simpler because you just got treble, bass, and volume. So the only thing I would note on the clean channel is that the master is modeled on the clean channel. The input drive on the clean channel becomes your volume, as you see over on the far right here, and the master volume is modeled like you would see over on the far left. So kind of an interesting difference with the lead and the clean channel here. Cab-wise, you've got a lot of options on this amp. I really like the on-hammer stuff. There is a 412 IR collection that On-Hammer makes with vintage 30s. Obviously, the G12T75s are an option too, but that's not really a speaker that was necessarily meant to be used with this amp. And actually, the stock speaker that the Shiva uses is a Celestion Classic Lead 80. through a 1 or a 2x12. And the only sim of that, if you'll go to the cab presets and type in Shiva or Shiv, sorry, because it's Shiver in here, you'll see these are all the Shiva cab sims that the Axe-Fx has by default, and they're all 112. This is the Celestion Lead 80 in here, but I will demo this cabinet IR in a second, and I'll show you why I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of it. I actually have 3 different IR presets. I've got the 412 Vintage 30 mix. I have the 112 Shiva cabinet with the classic Lead 80s here, and then finally I have the Ownhammer Bogner with the Celestion 25 watts on the 212. I have that IR mix on as well, which is not really a cab that Bogner recommends you use, but I think it sounds really good. Bogner, the actual manual says that the cab that is designed to be used with this amp is either the 112 or the 212 with the classic Lead 80s, but it says that if you want a more vintage classic tone, to use the Vintage 30 speakers, which I think I much prefer to the Lead 80s, but you can be the judge of that. Something I want to do really quickly is show you the kind of basic tonal differences between this and a very hot JCM 800 tone. Obviously, the Shiva is sort of a take on that JCM 800 Marshall architecture, but I think it sounds kind of different. So hopefully you can hear what I'm hearing here. All right, so what I hear is JCM 800 a little more snarly, more aggressive, not as polite, while the Shiva, to me, comes off as a little bit more modern, a little bit more thick in the bass. Some people would say muddy, I say thick. What is this amp for? What does it sound like? It is, I think the lead channel is a very thick, more processed sounding Marshall, maybe more of a quote recorded tone, right, that you might find on a record. And I think that's probably the goal of the amp too. The clean channel, as you'll hear later, is very bouncy, very full, twin reverby in a way. You want to run the volume really high on it. And it's a really great clean channel for an amp with such an awesome lead channel. I think that's why a lot of people like the amp so much. As far as famous users, there's probably far too many to name, and I refer to this amp as a stepping stone amp. It seems like over the last 20 years, a lot of artists have used the Shiva for a certain amount of time, and then they've kind of gone on to other amps. And I think the reason for that is it's a very specific sound. It's a very specific take on the hot-rodded Marshall sound. It's got a very unique voice. Even the clean channel, I think, is very unique. And I feel like a lot of artists and guitar players will fall in love with this amp either in the studio or live and maybe incorporate it into their rig for a while. But it seems like eventually that Shiva trick, if you will, sort of wears off. And I think a lot of great amps are that way, right? There's a reason that people kind of gravitate back to Marshalls a lot. They've got a very familiar sound, and you know what you're going to get. Even though I got that Jerry Cantrell tone at the beginning of the video, it's not a metal amp. It's not a high gain amp. It's more of a, I think it's a refined classic rock amp at its core. It's more of a plexi than an 800, although the 20th anniversary with the KT88s can get into that territory. This is the 20th anniversary head, by the way, with KT88s, and you can't just change the power tubes to EL34s because the whole amp is designed around the KT88s. It's a redesign of the Shiva architecture. And I do want to make a note of something. This 20th anniversary model we have does have a little more gain than the stock one. I think There was a misconception somewhere in the YEC guide, which is awesome. It has a lot of really cool info on this amp. I think it says just a little bit down here that the amp has less gain than the stock Shiva, and that is not actually true. It has more gain. And it says that in the manual. It has more gain than the stock Shiva, so just something to keep in mind there. All right, so let's walk through some tones here. I'm going to show you the regular lead channel I just showed you, comparing it to the 800. And really quickly, I'll run through the different cabs here. So this is the 412 with the vintage 30s, and then I'll show you the 112 with the classic lead 80. And finally, the 212 with the 25 watt Celestians. So all of those are a really different flavor, and my ears kind of prefer the 412, but I think for certain things, the 25 watt 212 could be really cool. I'm just not a big fan of these 112s with the lead 80s. They sound thin, they sound radio in a bad way. I think for certain tones they could be awesome, but it's just not really my thing, and I like to stick with the V30. So that's just sort of your mid-gain sound. And now I'm going to show you the Queen channel. By the way, I'm on a Les Paul Studio, completely stock, and I'm going to switch over to the neck pickup here and sort of show you some Queen stuff. Really a full bassy, kind of bouncy sounding Queen channel. Really cool for some subtle stuff. Awesome to put effects over, which I'm going to go ahead and do here. See if we can get some chimey rhythms out of this. Pretty good tones for a Les Paul neck humbucker. Really just full and lively. Volume and master up fairly high. I think you could probably even get away with cranking the master a little bit more. So that's the Queen channel. It's awesome. It's very Fendery, but kind of its own thing. I'll show you how some leads sound now on this amp. Awesome. Really juicy, flowing, never harsh leads. If you have a harsh guitar, this is the amp for you. And again, on the lead, I'm running a Tube Screamer, just no drive at all, just to kind of clean up the low end. It does two things super well, maybe three things, right? It does the low gain Marshall, it does the higher hot rodded gain Marshall, and it has an amazing clean channel, right? Not the most versatile amp in the world, but it does those three things super well, and I can't wait to do videos on the Bogner Ecstasy and the Ubershaw, which are awesome as well. If you have any questions, please hit me up, and see you guys next time.